All right. Hi, everybody. Hi, Eileen. Hi, Paula. Okay, now I got to figure out how to add Tim. It's been a month since I've had to do this. Let's see.
Hey,
Hey!
I hope you are quite well. Hello from Southern California. Is it warm in Southern
I was
California
going to
right
say,
now?
it must be nice there. It's rainy here.
Yeah, well, it's freezing in Massachusetts right now. At least when I was in Arkansas on Monday and Tuesday, I got to see like 87. A Stacy, 90 degrees, rub it in. Oh my gosh, ridiculous. Ridiculous.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know, Tim actually came to my state, Arkansas, for a conference, did a fabulous job, but we actually got to meet in person for the second time.
Yeah, that's right. Because the first time was in Tampa, right? And you know what's amazing though is like every time we're like, "Hey, let's go and like have dinner or something," and the plans just always just hit the fan every time. But I had no idea that I had a former student living in Little Rock, Arkansas, working a mile down the road. And Beth, I appreciate your graciousness with saying, "Tim, you can cancel our plans to go see that former student." Um,
Absolutely. Former students are important. I'm just surprised you have a former student in Little Rock, Arkansas.
I know, right? Well, that's because it was a military move.
Oh, okay.
So
I was like, that's
yeah, I'm like, who's who,
a little
who's
unusual.
in that? I don't know. Oklahoma, nice. Well, Cheryl, welcome from Oklahoma.
Yes, Oklahoma's near my end of the woods, I guess.
Yes. All right, in Michigan. All right, now are you on the glove side of Michigan or on the back leg of the dog side? Like I always, whenever I picture Michigan, I always picture a glove, and I always picture like the rear leg of a dog. I don't know. So which one is that? Phoenix, Kevin, welcome from Phoenix. I want to get to Arizona at some point. There's no doubt about that. And Shannon, I wasn't mocking Michigan. I hope you know that. That's just how I picture it. The dog leg and the and whatnot. Yeah,
77 in Phoenix. I'm impressed.
that's
When I
nice.
went to Phoenix, it was like 100, but that was in, I think, the summer.
Yeah, I'd be okay with 100 too. I really like it when it's like really, really hot and really, really humid. Like 100% humidity. That when even when it's not raining, like you need to walk out of your house with a snorkel just to breathe. I love that. A lot of people do not. For me, it's super good. But all right, Beth, why don't we start this show up here from today, or should I say for today? Tell people how this stuff works, and we'll go from there.
All right, absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for joining us and letting us know where you're watching from. We've got a lot of the US represented here, even DC and Metro Detroit, SoCal. So thank you everybody for joining us, New
Are,
Jersey.
are we international at all yet? I'm
I don't
wondering
know. Is
because a
anyone
couple
here
times.
from outside the US? That would be awesome.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know if the
I think we had a
timing would work.
Honduras last week for AP Lit, and I was like, oh my gosh, super cool that we can even do this now.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. So, if people have questions, because Tim and I are just going to kind of start by maybe answering some of our commonly asked questions for this point in the year. But if you have a question that you want answered, the easiest way for us is usually if people put it in the Q&A tab, which is kind of like at the top of the chat there, and just type your question in. And if you like somebody else's question, you can kind of like give it a thumbs up or a like or something, and we'll try to work through the Q&A tab. We do check the chat as well. It's just that the Q&A tab for our purposes is a little bit more streamlined.
yeah, absolutely. And as Beth said, we're going to start with our commonly asked questions for today, but then we're going to talk about approaches to argument. Now, that doesn't mean that we can only talk about argument today, but we'll probably deal with common approaches to argument. I'm doing some new stuff this year that I've talked about last year, and I'm starting to see some fruitfulness from it, or beginning to sow the seeds of fruitfulness from it. So we can talk about that too. Hey, Mindy from New York. I hope you are quite well. Everyone. Also, please note, and this is part of what we do here with our teacher chats on these Sundays. Please note, our teacher chats are always, always, always free, and we are happy to have non-AP people in here, especially if people want just approaches to teaching nonfiction kind of stuff. Because this isn't like an official AP Link chat. We can talk about whatever the heck we want. But please note that if anybody does donate to Beth Hall, to what we're doing here, every month we do actually give away 3 free resources. I give away video guides, Beth gives away video guides, and the way that these resources can work are you can send them home for homework and have kids interacting with and have students interacting with the content, and they're just like worksheets. Uh-oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because for some reason something ain't working. But anyway, so you can interact with them as like homework worksheets. They're great sub plans as well. And every month, Beth and I give away 3 free new ones. And so with any donation to us, and then Beth and I split the donation. So I don't want anybody to feel like, why is it going to Tim? Nope, it doesn't go to Tim. Beth and I will take care of business there. So I'm going to put links to that in the chat. If you want those things, you'll get those emailed later on tonight, at the latest tomorrow, but typically it's tonight. The only thing is though, is this, and this has been like a hard, and I've been learning about this over the last 2 months. If you decide that you want to donate for materials, not a problem. We're super grateful. But once again, this is always free. But please put your email in, like where you can write a little message, either in Venmo or PayPal. Just put your email in there so that I know where to send them to. So that later on tonight, I can send them from gardenofenglish.tim@gmail.com. Or tim@thegardenofenglish.com. I try to mix and match every month just so that I don't get labeled for spam. Okay, so I'll just put the information in there if you want to Venmo us at the Garden of English, and then it always asks for the last 4 digits, so it's 5153, or PayPal. There's a link right there to that. But after that, Beth, let's actually talk about some other things that we got going on. And by the way, we're going to announce a new community initiative that we have, but we're not going to do it for 4 more minutes. So Beth, common questions. I'll look in the Q&A chat. What are some things that you're getting already this year?
Okay, so oh man, we've got a lot of questions about a bunch of different topics, but I think a lot of us might be shifting from rhetorical analysis to argument. And I think one of the questions that I've been asked is, how do you get your students to write specific evidence? And this is something that I've been kind of grappling with as well, because I think for the most part, my students who take like APUSH, for instance, they tend to have really good historical knowledge, but I always get students who want to write about something like, pop culture. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind. And so the question is like, how can we make that evidence more specific? And I think there's different ways to do it. I've been this year trying to have my students do, like, I call it a quick write. And they do 1 a week. And so I might have them listen to a TED Talk or a podcast. 1 week they had to write about personal experience. That was kind of interesting because they were asking me if they could lie. And I said, well, it's your integrity. If I don't care,
I completely agree with that. I always tell them, I am all about that, Beth. I tell them I wouldn't do it. But if you think that a number on a test is worth more than your personal integrity, I can't make that choice for you.
I think the thing that I tell them too is just like, if you're writing about personal experience, don't go for the dramatic, make sure it's still like realistic and believable too. And make sure that with personal experience, there needs to be some kind of personal growth or message there. Cause I think a lot of times students will, especially with some of the prompts recently that have sort of lent themselves to personal experience. So like last year's one about timely decisions, and then the one the year before about perfection. I think the good thing about those prompts is that they can be very student friendly. I don't love the timely decisions one. My students who took the exam last year were not a huge fan of that one.
What's so funny is that prompt would have actually been really good if it only kept the first sentence that Powell said, as opposed to the first and the second, because the second sentence is what made it very, very hard for them to deal with. And it also did not put the quote in context with other things that he'd actually said about the nature of timely decisions and whatnot. Now, Beth, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, just because the 2 answers that are in the 2 questions in the Q&A deal with donations and whatnot. Basically, what happens here, folks, with donations is every month, Beth and I supply new video worksheets. They're not the same ones as the month before. So if it's a donation thing, if you choose to do it that month, cool. If you choose not to that month, fine. And if you choose to never do it, that's also fine too. We can answer all your questions here. That's not a problem at all. And we're happy to do that. So there isn't pressure here. There's just stuff that we'll give if people choose to donate. That's all. So hopefully I clarified that. But those are the 2 questions in the chat. So anyway, Beth, I do apologize for that, but I do think, right, that the benefit would have been to just have that first sentence from that prompt as opposed to the first and second. I think kids would have been able to do a little bit better with it.
Yeah, I agree with you. It was especially because most students take the test in order. It was like that's how they're ending their test. And it was kind of like, I think students kind of had this moment of panic of like, what do I write about? And
Yeah.
so that's something that I'm working with my students on is we build to timed writes, we build to cold reads, but sometimes their initial ideas are not always their strongest. Like sometimes they need to actually take the time to list out their ideas and really think about what can they write specifically about and like which ideas pair well together, because sometimes the first idea is actually not their strongest piece of evidence. But I think sometimes, especially with time situations, students want to write because they're so worried they're going to run out of time that they don't plan well enough.
Yeah. Yep. And that's one of those timely decisions. A lot of kids should have written about planning their essays. That would have been.
I think I read a lot of essays about kids planning their essays.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that I read the timely decision essay. So I was in the alternate universe this past year. So we were reading all the alternate.
I was initially on rhetorical analysis with Sotomayor, and then we had the opportunity to read the others as well. So definitely interesting. But I think argument with the specific evidence, that's to me one of the foundational skills where once they understand what specific evidence is and they remember that they have to include some of those important concrete details and really make sure they're answering the question. That's the thing that I see a lot with some of my students who are emerging writers is I know why they're writing it because I know them. So I because I know them as a student, I can follow their line of reasoning. But if I were to give someone who didn't know them that essay, it would, and that's where as teachers, we kind of got to distance ourselves and be like, okay, what is the passage or not the passage? What does the essay actually say? Because they need to be aware of when their line of reasoning gets faulty. So that's, I think, the big issue for me right now in class is that specific evidence.
Yeah. And so I'll talk a little bit about things that I've been doing this year that have kind of spiced that up a little bit for me. But real quick, for people that are taking any notes at all, I tell my students, and I do the same. I do something very similar in AP Lit for the literary argument. Is I tell them that their evidence has to be between 3 and 5 sentences long. Can't be any longer than 5. Can't be any less than 3. If they choose to do 3 sentences of evidence, the first sentence has to be the context that leads up to what they're talking about. If they really want to talk about Jake Paul fighting Anderson Silva last night, that's fine, but they better give me at least one. They better give me at least one buildup as to Jake Paul moving from YouTube to boxing, so that I can understand why he's fighting a former UFC champion. Okay, and everyone here is like, I don't care about that crap, right? But nonetheless, they need to have context here. So if they do 3 sentences, the first sentence is going to be something contextual. And then the next 2 sentences are going to be a detailed description of their example where they have to focus on their verbs. I tell my kids, your verbs have to be the best to convey what you're looking for. And then if they do 5 sentences, the first 2 sentences have to be a contextual discussion. Before you describe your example in 3 really precise sentences, the first 2 have to be the context so that I know what the heck we're talking about. And that is helpful for the kids to know, okay, topic sentence, 5 sentences for evidence, and then I got to do my commentary. But I've got commentary stems for that. I think that you do too, that kind of a thing. Now, before we answer my question that I've been receiving as of late, I am going to announce something, assuming that you're cool with that, Beth. Is that true?
Sure.
Cool with that? All right, folks. So Beth and I have been talking, and so a couple of things happen a lot. We get asked a lot of questions. That's why we started here today with like, hey, let's do some common questions we're asked before we talk about argument. But also we're tagged a lot in we're tagged a lot in comments, and people actually want us to respond. And sometimes we even miss it, or people just put our name in there, but they don't tag us. And then people are like, Freitas, why didn't you talk to me, right? And I'm like, because A, I have a full-time job and 5 kids, and I run the Garden of English, and B, I wasn't tagged. So because of that, I don't always know. And then, people are a little bit upset with me, which is kind of odd. But Beth and I were talking about it. And another thing, too, is that, we're active on the AP Facebook pages. But the AP Facebook pages are predominantly AP. And a lot of times you see those. This isn't AP related, and we decided that we wanted to create a community where we could be a little bit more accessible, easier. And so I'm going to put a little link here in the chat, and we want to invite you to ask to come into this private group here, because this is the English Coaching Garden, and it's meant for teachers from middle school to high school, and really focusing on skill development. So if you look at the rules and stuff, we're not looking to get into politics. We're not looking to get into anything like that. We're not going to shut down political posts as long as they're tied to lesson plans. So if someone wants to post something political and there's a good lesson plan that goes with it, people can do that. We're not trying to micromanage, but we are trying to have a very, very, very skilled, focused set of discussions for teachers in this community. And we wanted to open it up to, AP Lit, AP Lang, and just general English teaching, because we all teach more than just AP. And so I would ask that you try to, that you request permissions to join, and that you share it with your entire faculties there. The other rule that we have too is we are not opposed to people posting YouTube videos there of their own accord. We're actually also not opposed to people commercializing there in two circumstances. And that is, if you have something that answers a question that is going to help another teacher, but it's for sale on Teachers Pay Teachers, you're allowed to post that in the comments. And then the third Saturday of every month, you could post whatever you want, as long as it is a teacher educator resource. But you can have its own post that way. We just decided that we didn't want to necessarily have to micromanage all that stuff. But if we were to decide that a post is too political, we'll just delete it. So we're going to moderate it. But it helps Beth and me be able to be contacted a bit easier. It opens things up past AP. And it really focuses on skill-based stuff, as opposed to hey, I just saw this video, could it work in my class? No, if you're going to post something that's potentially contentious, it's got to come with a lesson plan too, just so that we have skills and focus at all times. So anyway, you've got that link right there. I can actually share a picture of it right here, I think. Let me see. Oh, there's my screen. Boom. So we'll hopefully be getting an influx of, hey, can we come in and join us here? And you'll notice that Beth and I will post our videos and stuff here and whatnot. And we will try to get people joining. But we ask that you do consider supporting us by telling your faculty members about it. And they might be able to get some community support as well for things outside of AP and just good writing instruction and advice. So anyway, sorry for talking so much, Beth. It's back to you.
No, it's good. I appreciate it. I'm excited to see people join that as well. And it's not that we're ignoring the other communities that we're active in. It's just like an extension of the conversation that we start here. We want to support English teachers in whatever way we can.
Yeah.
So I'll actually I mentioned the quick write slides. So let me put the link in the chat. It'll be a copy link to some Google Slides that I give my students. And I think I've shared them in the past. And you can go through and take what you like, delete what you don't. It's totally fine. But I think getting students to write about the prompts, or even just getting them to, write about something that they're learning in history class, or a podcast that they listen to. Because I think that relates to the question in the Q&A is how can they generate evidence with a difficult prompt? I think getting students to realize that they have more knowledge than they think they do is the first step. Because so many of my students have said, well, I don't know anything about anything. And it's no, that's not true. You have 16 or 17 years of life experience. You do know a lot. You've been sitting in class. We've read things in class. You're in other classes. So it's just getting them to kind of realize not only that they do in fact know things, but to try to prioritize the stuff that they can write about well. Because some of the best essays I've had from some of my students who maybe didn't think they were a strong writer were about when they were writing about something that they were passionate about. So one of my former students is actually a softball player for the University of Arkansas. And I forgot what prompt it was, but there was one time where she could connect it to softball. And that was the best paragraph I think she's ever written, because it was just so specific and so detailed, and there was really good commentary. So I think sometimes students put so much pressure on themselves to choose these, nuanced examples. And honestly, I've only read for the exam for a couple years, but we do a mock exam in Arkansas every year. So I've read for that for 8 years. And I think that we see the same examples a lot. I don't know if you've noticed that too, Tim, but when we look at the state test, at least a couple years ago, everybody wrote about Edison, and we're and they all thought they were probably so original. And I read probably 200 essays from Arkansas students about Edison.
And it's funny because even in the synthesis paper, they've got all of this language over 7 sources, and all of the kids take the exact same quotes. So they've got these full pages and whatnot. Absolutely. Now, Beth, do you mind if I answer the most common question I've been receiving as of late?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, folks, I've been asked some scoring questions as of late, pretty consistently. Beth and I have been talking about doing a Sunday night where we talk about scoring and whatnot. We have to find opportunities to not necessarily use College Board released materials, just so that they don't feel like we're stepping on their toes or anything like that. So I'm gonna reach out to a partner company that I work with the Garden of English, and see if I can get some sample papers to talk about scoring. But a lot of the scoring stuff that I get is one of the ones that I received most recently was, my student is providing a rhetorical analysis and I can actually see the kid's reasoning, but unfortunately the reasoning is incorrect. Or sorry, the kid missed the purpose or overgeneralized the purpose. And so what would I do? What would I do with that? And the truth is, folks, is that if a kid has incorrect commentary, even if the paper is written well, it's going to be a 1-2-0. A 1-2. Now, there are a bunch of ways that you can get the sophistication point. If that kid writes a 1-2 because the kid missed the purpose, but that kid has significant linguistic skill, could that kid potentially get a 1-2-1? Yep. I think that in the last 2 years, I've given out probably 3 1-2-1s. And let me tell you, they are rare. Okay. That's a lot of essays that I've read, but a 1-2-1 can actually exist. Okay. When it comes to that kind of thing, just note. Now, another question that shows up a bunch is, hey, I get this all the time. Tim, can you check out this thesis statement? Can you check out this body paragraph? I'm like, no, I'm teaching my class, but I'm not trying to be a jerk. So if that's ever been you, I'm not complaining about it. I'm just like, I got to work too. But in your classroom, if you think you're being too hard, that is actually better than being too easy. It's just the truth. Right? You know what a good thesis statement looks like. You know what evidence looks like. You know what a topic sentence does. And it might score well on the AP exam, but if you're scoring a little bit too hard in your class, I know it's best to try to be as normed as possible. But if you have higher expectations when exam day comes, you can rest a little bit more easy. So I want to encourage y'all to just kind of, all right, I can read what this says. I know what I really like and prefer here to get good writers. So I want to do that here. Now, we don't want to discourage kids and give kids a 1-1-0 when they deserve a 1-3-0. That's very different. But for the most part, having a high standard isn't necessarily a bad thing. Beth, we did have a question about synthesis here. And the question is basically that this particular teacher says that the students can brainstorm their own ideas first and use sources to help develop their own ideas, so that sometimes they bring their own anecdotal evidence into their synthesis papers. Someone has tried to brainwash these students, and now they're becoming resistant to the idea, and so the teacher is having second thoughts. What do you feel? How do you feel about that, Beth? And then I'll tell you all how I feel.
Okay, so I have told my students that. I've told them, like, hey, brainstorm first. And if we're doing it as a class, I usually will kind of ask them to think of ideas first. That backfired on me once, and I don't use the prompt anymore. But a few years ago, I used a really old one about space exploration, and all the ideas my kids brainstormed for that were wonderful. They were not supported by the sources at all, and the kids are like, "So what are we supposed to do?" And I was like, So I do have them brainstorm a little bit, but I don't know that my students actually do that on the exam. And I've also had my students say, for instance, I like the prompt about eminent domain. I save that for much later in the year because my students will usually ask, like, can you give us a prompt that's really hard? And my students don't know much about eminent domain unless they've taken AP Gov. I think then they do. So I save that one because sometimes if they don't know anything about the topic, it's hard to brainstorm. And in those cases, I tell them, for the timing of the exam, just go to the sources, look for what you think is a convincing argument, and kind of proceed as needed. So I do think there can be value in brainstorming and getting them to think about it, especially as a class, before, like as you're kind of working through a prompt. But I think it's also important for us teachers to recognize that on the exam, some of the stuff that we teach them in class might not be how they approach it on the exam. And that's not just synthesis. I kind of tell my students when we're like annotating stuff in class, like, on the exam, you might not do it this way. You won't have the time or whatever the case may be. So I've definitely done it that way. I was told to do it that way. I think when I first started teaching AP, I think that was kind of the general recommendation that our presenter had. So I use that approach sometimes, but I do think there's times when maybe students feel more comfortable just going straight to the sources. I think the reason against that is that sometimes then they don't have those nuanced ideas. But I'm trying to think of how to say this politely. Not all students are going to have those nuanced ideas anyway. So some of them do need the sources as guidance. So I think it depends on which type of students that we have. Some of my higher students, that I might have them approach it slightly differently than my ones who are still kind of grappling with the concept of synthesis and the conversation of sources. So you might, I don't know, maybe differentiate a little bit, because I think holding students to that standard can be really helpful. But I can also think of several of my students who, if the brainstorming might make them feel like a little bit discouraged, or it might like prevent them from writing because they would get so stuck in like not knowing what to think about that they would just kind of be paralyzed. So I don't know. That's just kind of my immediate reaction.
That just made me think of a really cool assignment that you could do. Now, I've done something similar to this, but I haven't done exactly this because I was just thinking about it. But I've given my kids a synthesis prompt without the sources before, and just been like, and I turned it into an argument prompt. So argue your position on, the use of daylight savings or something like that. I don't know. Right. But, and then I've given them the synthesis prompt after with the sources. And I was like, okay, hey, now build your argument with the sources too, like kind of like a synthesized kind of thing. But what I've never done is I've never made them write the argument itself and then given them the sources and then try to produce the synthesis itself and then talk about the difference in it, because kind of like what you said, what if the kids write their own argument and it's about the same task, but there's no actual evidence in the sources that can back it up, so they can't really bring them into their argument. You know what I mean? And so I'm wondering, what that would look like if I was like, hey, I want you to write a thesis and, one paragraph, thesis topic sentences in one paragraph about this, and then give it to them with sources and see how things change, but then get them to reflect on that change. What did the sources do? Because if the kids can recognize what the sources did in how they produce their argument, they'll then know what works best for them. Do I want to create my own argument first and then deal with the sources after? Or did having the sources really allow me to shore up an argument that I had and whatnot? One other thing I want to just add to this particular conversation is that I make my kids, even if they're talking about eminent domain, at least in class, attempt to bring in their own lives into the conversation. And so what that looks like for them is it's going to show up in their conclusion. And the reason why I do it this way is because in their conclusions, I tell them, like, look, if I were to bring in if I were to just say, hey, I'm collecting money for, in need children in the local city or something like that, or in the local area, I want you all to give me like $5. My students would be like, no way. Right. But if I bring in little Johnny Sue, and little Johnny Sue has tattered sneakers and is like, I really just want a new pair of sneakers, all of my kids are gonna be like, yeah, no problem. I'll give $5. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because why are kids more compelled to do that? Because it's way more humanized, right? And so I tell my students, think about how in some way you relate to this prompt and tell a story about it, and allow that to build into what you have to say about the ideas that are there. So, for example, a few years ago, they had the windmill prompt, and I had a student who talked about being out on Cape Cod, and how when she looks out her windows of her house, that they put up windmills there, and people complain about how ugly it is, right? And then she kind of shifted the narrative, though, that as ugly as that might be, who actually cares when, it's actually, significantly more sustainable, and it's going to be a lot uglier if we just keep industrializing, something along those lines. And so her conversation went from telling a story about her own house and her own community to the ugliness of global industrialization, without trying to remediate it. It's a good example. And when I have kids that are like, well, what do you do with eminent domain? How on earth can I talk about eminent domain? Well, a few years ago in Fall River, which is a city that's decently close to where I live, it's about an hour away. A lot of kids' housing areas were being bought up for a super Walmart. So kids had to deal with that. I know the eminent domain prompt had a lot of kids actually who lived on the border talking about like getting land bought from, their neighbors' houses or their houses for the wall. But my kids are like, yeah, but I have nothing for that. And I'm like, have you ever been moved from your room or from your bedroom or from your home? Like, hey, we're moving and you don't have a choice about it. You don't have the power there. I mean, you still have to do it. I'm like, you can tell that story so that you can make something universal at the end about authority and the responsibilities of authority in dealing with other human beings. And they were like, oh my gosh, yeah. So it's not eminent domain per se, but this still deals with those ideas. And that really makes it personal. And the reason why I like it when kids do that, especially in their conclusion, is because it gets things emotional, but it's logically emotional. And it shows that they can synthesize their lives into the essay itself. And that to me is the big part. If we're talking about a synthesis, I can synthesize sources, no problem, but I can synthesize this into my life and the world around me. One other example, and I'm sorry for how emotional this can get, but I once had a student who did is college worth the cost essay in my classroom. And I tell this story as often as I can, and because it was just so moving. She started her paper and she said, my dad didn't go to college and he's been working as a whatever for the last 20 years. My mom went to college and has been working for such and such. And then she said 3 years ago, my mom was diagnosed with a particular terminal illness. And she's like, ironically enough, my dad was making enough money to support us all. So my mom didn't have to work anymore while she battled this. And her last sentence of her paper was, all I know is that after thinking about this entire element, degree or not, cancer doesn't care, period. That was her last line. And I was just like, boom, wow. What a compelling connection to that paper. So sorry for talking as much as I did there, Beth, but that's
really good. And I agree with you. I think those personal connections and situating it in that broader context in the conclusion is really helpful. And, as far as like, I think because the original question had something to do with, just like getting a nuanced argument and connecting it to things. Sometimes like when students are doing like the cursive writing prompt or STEM, they might have commentary about that they can even include in the body paragraphs if they're not ready to put it in the conclusion. And sometimes that shows a little bit of possibly a little bit of nuance, possibly that broader context. So I think there's definitely times when it's appropriate for them to interject personal experience as well.
The College Board actually released a high scoring example for that is the technology and education prompt, which I think was 2011. Don't quote me on the 2011 part, but the student samples, one of the kids talks about how he can now do labs on his computer, but he doesn't know what they feel like. So he's not sure he can do it in real life or something like that. And he used that as part of his example. So you're absolutely right. And the College Board has released an example like that. Here we go. Beth, question here. It says this one, and we'll try to go in order that's in the chat at least. It says, what is your suggestion for moving through the year? Is it RA, argument synthesis? Like, what's the recommended route? We answer this all the time. But what's your route? Because your route is different than my route.
So I start with rhetorical analysis. So we're actually just about wrapping that up and moving on. I typically move to synthesis next because in our curriculum, students do a little bit of that in sophomore year anyway. So they have experience with it. And I've just found that my students tend to do better when they have those concrete sources to look at to support their argument. So I do RA synthesis, then argument, because my students find argument the hardest. And also the unit that I do, we're in it right now, it's about education. The sources in that unit go from, like, it's easy for me to pivot from rhetorical analysis to synthesis, but in the middle of that, like, we do argument. Like, we were reading, they read The C Word in the Hallways last week, which deals with like mental health. And a couple students were like, can we write an argument about this? And I was like, That's not part of the curriculum right now, but I'm glad that you're passionate about it. So I think there's
Yeah.
opportunities for them to do it. I had them watch a TED talk from Sir Ken Robinson about schools killing creativity. And I gave them kind of like not an essay, but like a mini argument response to that. And they had a whole lot to say about whether or not schools kill creativity. So I do have them do like mini arguments in response to some of the topics that we cover, but I save like my actual argument instruction and like the full essay writing and stuff for last, just because my students tend to do better with synthesis. But if I had to flip it, there would be nothing wrong with that either.
I do move from rhetorical analysis to argument synthesis just because I actually think, well, I agree that argument is harder. And so when I teach kids to write their arguments first, I then go to synthesis because then I don't have to worry about them summarizing sources as much in synthesis because they're so focused on creating their own argument. So I try to lay the foundation of writing their own arguments first so that they don't go into source summary for that. Now, I do also have very strict instruction for thesis statements and topic sentences, which move them away from source summary. But that's not always the case. The best tip that I can give any teacher, especially a new teacher, for getting your kids away from source summary is to never let them quote a source in a topic sentence.
Oh, yeah.
I teach my kids how to do it, but only when they're going to concede or only when they're going to refute. That's the only time I really let them do it in a topic sentence. Otherwise, if they start with, source B says or blah, 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 no good. Another thing, too, is I don't allow my students to ever say says, states, or claims. I give them other verbs. I give them a list of other verbs that they can choose. But says, states, and claims are always off limits. And I give them a list of words like argues, posits, theorizes, challenges, augments, emphasizes, rebuttals, offers a rebuttal, just these kind of phrases that can help kids, and I just say choose one. So, hey, but as you're writing this in, if you're going to put the author's name, you got to put the credentials with it too. And then you put whatever verb is actually here. But yeah, so Beth and I switch. My best friend who teaches AP Lang the exact same way that I do. And I know that because we used to teach together and we would do the same thing on the same day. Since we no longer work together, he has switched synthesis and argument. He's like, Tim, I'm doing it that way. And I'm like, well, Scott, because you are your own man, you are welcome to do it that way. And he's had a lot of success with it. So there's no like one way to eat a Reese's. Okay. But you just want to make sure that no matter what order you do it in, that you have a very easy segue for the kids to recognize, oh, here's why we did it this way. For me, we just read a bunch of awesome arguments for rhetorical analysis. Now let's create our own arguments that we could have each other rhetorically analyze. And then now let's consider argument, and synthesis there. Beth, is it possible for you, to put in the article title of what you said by Sir Ken Robinson?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yep. It's also, a TED Talk. I can put a link.
Gotcha. Also, somebody put in here said, I seem to have missed where you can access the resources for this particular month. What that was in reference to is we do accept $15 donations. If people want to, this is always free, but people that donate do get extra resources, and those will be sent out. That link will be sent out later on tonight from my email once I go through. So that's what that is in reference to. I'll put the links to that if anybody cares to donate. If you don't care to, that's not a problem at all. So just a note about that. But those resources this month are for commentary videos, rhetorical choice videos, and prompt breakdown videos. So that is that there. All right. So Beth, we did the ordering one. Here we go. What is your favorite College Board prompt to start synthesis with? College Board prompt.
Oh, that's a good question. Okay. It's kind of hard because my sophomores, when they do synthesis, they do a unit on nature and we do the locavore prompt and they find that one pretty approachable.
I love that prompt. And what's really good about that too, and sorry for interrupting, Beth, but it's that's a topic that most kids don't know about, but they'll get right into that prompt. I love that.
Yeah, I like that one because Arkansas is pretty agricultural, but they understand The argument of convenience and, Walmart being there. Like our town is like, so I live in a town with one stoplight and I work in a town with two stoplights, but we have a Walmart and both towns have three pizza places, which is totally unnecessary. But oh yes, the C word in the hallways. Thank you for putting that. I had forgotten. And so those two sources, by the way, don't necessarily pair together. The C word in the hallways is about mental health. Please read that before you give it to your students because it does reference suicide. So possible content or trigger warning. It's safe and appropriate for my students, but I do give a content warning before I give it to them. But the school is killing creativity. There is a College Board prompt. It's kind of old, but it's about creativity. I forgot what year it's from. But it's kind of weird because it says like write a letter to your school board, but they're really writing an essay, but it's about creativity. So I sometimes pair those two together.
That's the argument prompt, I think, from 2014, if I remember.
Yeah, correctly. I knew it was a little bit old. I kind of started tweaking it because my students were like, write to your school board. So I kind of tweaked the phrasing a little bit. But yeah, the C word in the hallways deals with mental health, but it also loosely ties into education. And my students really like that one.
And what did you say was your favorite prompt to start with for synthesis? What was the topic of it? The locavore?
Yeah, well, for my sophomores, because we talk about nature, I like the locavore one. And for education, there are so many good ones about education that I've been kind of rotating which one I do. There's an older one about English curriculum, which I think is pretty approachable. I think it's a Form B prompt, maybe.
Yep. I'll find it right here. I just put the locavore in the chat. I've got another one for education in a minute, but I'll find the. You're looking for the one about to what extent is which one was it again?
It has to do with like English curriculum. I think it's a Form B one from like maybe 2011. I usually have students read. It's a piece by Francine Prose. It's like I Know Why the Cage Bird Cannot Read. It's in the is it Bedford Language of Composition? It's in Language of Composition, 3rd edition. So they read that, and then that's kind of our bridge into synthesis. But I think there are some other really approachable education ones. There's a couple on AP Classroom that I like as well that my students have enjoyed. That I think you could use instead. So there's a lot of good ones about education. So if you have a unit on education and you're looking to bring up synthesis, there are several options. Even the STEM prompt that we talked about, the cursive writing prompt, the Meatless Monday one, my students always kind of get a chuckle out of that one because they're like, wait, people actually want to do this. You got to remember I live in Arkansas. So there's a few on AP Classroom as well. If you're looking for stuff that is College Board but maybe hasn't been on an exam, you have to obviously like follow their guidelines and stuff, but there's a few good ones on AP Classroom that I use if I need to like switch stuff out because sometimes I just don't like to assign the same prompt like multiple years in a row just because like not that I think the students are going to cheat, but sometimes I like to switch it up. So yeah, there's a lot with education.
Yeah. My actual favorite one to start with, I'm going to post it in the chat right now. But this one, I'm going to just show it to y'all. Actually, I'm going to share the screen. I'll put it in the chat too. Let me see if I can share here. Good. There it is. Is this one right here about technology in the classroom? And like I said, this is the one that has a really nice tech in schools. And this has a really cool student sample that the kid brings in, doing labs in a science class and whatnot. The only problem with this particular piece is that this comes from the 2010 exam. I knew it was something a little bit older. And that's so crazy to me that 2010 is now deemed like older. And then I think about how when I was in college in 2006 and I was in my business class and they were like, hey, they're going to release an iPod Touch. I was like, who would ever want to like put their thumbs on a screen while they're gaming? Yeah, now look how we're stupid. But anyway, the thing that you have to do is like here it talks about, the ubiquitous nature of technology in our lives. And it says computers and cell phones, which are fine. But then it says PDAs. No kid has a clue what the heck a PDA is. They're like a public display of affection. What is that? And I'm like, no, and I show them what a Palm Pilot was because the Palm Pilot was huge when I was like in 6th grade. And then they're like MP3 players. What? And then I have an old iPod, Classic or whatever they call it. And I'm like, yeah, these are awesome. So you might want to change this up a little bit if you give it to your kids. And the sources are also really short. And this is rather intriguing for me because look at how short these sources kind of used to be for synthesis. Now they're just so long. So
I
I'm
was thinking
intrigued.
that as well.
Yeah. If you go back to older synthesis stuff, you might want to try to figure out if you can find some sources to augment so you can give them a little bit more of um, an authentic read here. But I don't augment it because this is the one that I start with. And this is why it's great to start with this from College Board because these are short sources. So my kids don't have to overread and whatnot. And I'm like, hey, you know what? That's going to be kind of cool for what we're doing. And so I posted that right in the chat for y'all. So the kind of approachable synthesis questions that Beth and I just mentioned, I tried to find them all and get them in the chat for you too. The only one that I couldn't find was I didn't think I found the one that says, the kindergarten, sorry, the English curriculum. There's one about
I'll see if I can find it.
kids
There
should
is a
read.
kindergarten one on AP Classroom that's actually pretty good.
Yes. And that actually was a past, I think that was a past international exam that they've now taken out of commission there. Let's see. Anything else here in the question? Nope. All right. So before we talk about argument and approaches to argument here with the last 15 to 20 minutes that we have, does anybody have another question they really want us to get out before we say, hey, let's talk about approaches to argument here? While you think about that, I'm going to just drop in the link to the new Facebook community that Beth and I are trying to start for all teachers. And it's not just about us, by the way, it's so that we can all encourage one another, but Beth and I are going to be the moderators of it. So that is there. So I've already accepted a bunch of people. Beth, did you accept a bunch of people in there yet?
Yes.
Good. So we're starting to build a community. That's a pretty cool thing. And I appreciate you all for wanting to do that. All right. Approaches to argument, Beth. What is your foundational approach here as we start shifting towards either argument or synthesis, knowing that they kind of have the same root skills?
So I think there's a few things that I think are important to kind of keep in mind. Clarifying terminology from the get-go is usually pretty important because and this actually brings up a commonly asked question too. A lot of students, not just teachers, ask about like counter arguments and like, are they needed? So I like to make sure that like my students are familiar with those terms, but I don't require a counterclaim and rebuttal and stuff early on. We just kind of make sure that they're aware of those. I have a few different activities that I've done. I'm actually working on some argument stuff to release hopefully in the next couple weeks. To introduce argument. And I know there's some great ideas out there in the Facebook groups as well. Just to kind of have like speed debates. I've done that a couple times just to get kids like arguing about like silly topics. Like, is a hot dog a sandwich?
That's how I start. Oh yeah. How should a cat wear pants? You know what? Just real quick with this silly topic part. I haven't done this with my kids yet because I like to do his cereal soup. And I love to talk about how I've changed my mind over the years, based on how students have changed my mind. But one of the pictures that recently showed up is the how should a giraffe wear a tie? And the reason why that one is so important to do in your classroom, folks, if you want to start argument to just try to get kids used to dealing with complexity, is that a giraffe should wear a bow tie up at the top of its neck under its jaw. However, it should wear a regular necktie down at the bottom so it can cover that kind of torso. And that's kind of nuanced there. So kids have to figure out, well, what kind of tie are we talking about? And then they can actually have a real thesis that says a giraffe should wear a tie in two different spots depending upon, and then,
you have a very nuanced argument there.
That's right. And that's a great way to teach that kind of nuanced argument. And it's a really, really fun question. And this year I'm going to bust it out.
Yeah, there's some really great like approachable ones. I even had students submit some one year and they came up with ones that these won't work for everybody's classroom, but you had to know the kids. But one student submitted like, what is the correct way to put toilet paper on the roll? Like, does it go
Yes.
like whatever. And there was a whole argument about that. And then there was one, and it was just so funny. It was about toothpaste, and it was like, where do you squeeze the toothpaste from? And my door was open. We're not allowed to have open doors anymore for school safety, but my principal happened to be walking by, and all she heard was a student say, "You heathen, you squeeze it from the middle." And she like stuck her head in, and I was like, it's academic, I promise. We're just arguing about toothpaste. So like fun ones like that get them talking. I know people have done things with like snack cakes, and I've done like a bracket, kind of like a March Madness bracket, but like with like other topics like food, Disney movies. Most students have seen them, so I let them vote on what goes in the bracket, and then they have to argue like who would win the face off, or like which one's better. So anything you can do to bring it and keep it like fun and kind of lighthearted in the beginning, because if we can make argument accessible for our students, that really helps. And so, they can argue about all kinds of stuff as well. So that's how I like to start.
One of the things about doing those fun arguments too, and this is how you like want to get, well, in my class, the reason why I start there is because they are very low stakes. But the other thing too that I really try to drive home is that as they articulate their arguments about whether a hot dog is a sandwich or whether cereal is soup or whatever, kids will naturally be drawn to do what we need them to do in their nuanced arguments. So for example, right, is cereal soup? One kid at the very beginning is going to be like, well, what's your definition of soup? Right? That's important. I will note that on the board. Okay. I try to note every move that I want my kids to be incredibly cognizant of. So for example, a few years ago, I did how should a cat wear pants? And when one of my students was just mortified that it could be on the front paws and the back paws, but not cover the butt, the student was like, pants cover butts. That's how you know they're pants, right? And I was like, okay, so if I wear an extra long shirt, I can just say I'm wearing pants. And the kid looked at me and said, yes, right? And now the whole class laughed. But this is important, folks, because I wrote this up on my board of things that we want to know. How stubborn are we to not change our minds when all of the evidence points in the entire other direction? And I said, you need to be cognizant of that because you need to be willing to change your mind. And that's why the is cereal soup is a very important conversation to me, because I had a student 2 years ago absolutely convince me. I was like, cereal and soup, cereal is soup. And I've been saying that for years, and I will never say it again, ever, because this kid had the best reasoning and evidence behind it. So as kids talk about the definitions and assumptions and whatnot, it's good. One of the recommendation that I want to give to, especially to new Lang teachers, is do not talk about Tolman argument. Don't do it. Now, Beth, do you talk about, Beth, do you talk about Tolman?
No.
Okay. And why don't you talk about it?
I don't know, because honestly, it's just because I don't want to have them feel like they're stuck to a formula from the beginning, I guess. And like, there's other ways to do it. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so and I'm not trying to call it, I'm not like, oh, Beth, why not? Right. That's not how I meant it. But I because obviously, in our field, we've heard of it and whatnot. And I was like, oh, I wonder what's going on here. Folks, it's really important. I know that the language of composition has Tolman argument in it. Toss that out. And the reason why is because Tolman argument is a way to break down an argument. It's not like an actual structure, like the classical argument structure or the Rogerian structure. Tolman, you can fit into one sentence, and it just breaks down the parts of an argument. What's the evidence? What's the assumption with that evidence? What's the claim, essentially? And then what prompted this whole conversation? So it's like a one sentence kind of breakdown kind of thing. And really, all it is a syllogism. It's like a templated syllogism, essentially. But the reason why I encourage you not to talk about Tolman is because Tolman has this thing called the warrant, which is just the assumption that's tied to the evidence and how it relates to the claim. And quite frankly, folks, that confuses kids when you're trying to search for these kind of things, when those assumptions, that's commentary. That's what a warrant is. It's commentary, right? Why not just call it commentary? And so I really want to just kind of encourage new teachers, if you're kind of lost in that Tolman language, it's not part of the course and exam description. you don't have to go there, even though it's listed in a good textbook. And it is a good textbook, but no way. Leave it alone. So you're not trying to figure out something that's not for us to, well, I shouldn't say it's not for us to figure out, but it's not needed for the class essentially. And it's not going to help them structure their argument any better because it's not a full argument structure. It's a way to break down an argument. Anything else about starting argument there, Beth, that I cut you off from? I'm sorry, I talked too much.
Oh no, I think that was good. Let's see, we talked about like some fun activities. So like the March Madness style bracket, the fun debates, things like that. I would say something, I know you and I talked about this in a video that we collabed on. It was like a couple years ago at this point, but it might be worth mentioning the different, like, because you do S cubed, I typically use chores, but so we give like our students acronyms. So chores stands for current events, history, outside knowledge, reading, experience, and I say S is science. I did not invent that. Somebody else did. I just don't know to whom I deserve or owe the credit. But something else that I have my students do sometimes is, so when we're kind of like brainstorming possible evidence, I'll have them go through and put the language from the rubric. So there's general evidence, somewhat specific, and specific. Because sometimes students come up with evidence like, let's say, I don't know, like when I ask a question about like disobedience and they tell me like the American Revolution, like that's super broad. It's super general. So we want to have them, now that could be broken down into something much more specific, but I think it's important to get students to realize like what general evidence is versus what specific evidence is, because they're going to need that specific evidence as they're constructing their essay. And just as a side note, while I'm thinking of it, like hypotheticals, I tell my students not to put those in there because I want them to use real world examples. I don't want a like, suppose a 17-year-old kid did this kind of thing, you know. But I do think getting students to understand the general versus somewhat specific versus specific distinctions can be really helpful as well. So I just kind of have them look at their chores, you know, acronym and see how, or mnemonic, and have them kind of write down what comes to mind. I don't require them to do an even number of notes per category. Someone asked me that once, like, so my kids, some of their categories, like, I don't know, usually science and reading are ones that are harder for them. So if they can't think of something and we're brainstorming in class, I'm okay with that. And I'll also kind of have them, well, I'll put the notes on the board, or I'll have them talk it over with a partner. And that's, I think, important too, is because sometimes we've been doing a prompt in class and someone will remind the whole class, well, remember last week in history class, she was talking about this, and then they'll all be like, oh yeah, and then they'll add it to their papers. So that collaborative planning, especially in the beginning, can be really helpful because students will kind of remind each other of things that they've learned that might be good evidence. So just, you know, that distinction between like what specific evidence actually is, I think is really helpful if you can get them to understand that sooner rather than later.
Yeah. One of the new things that I've done, and I'll talk about my acronym in just a moment, but this is something that I started this year. I thought of it last year, but it was too late to really get it going. This right here is just how I give my kids my lesson plans every day. And so they have like what we're doing and stuff filled in and whatnot, and like scaffolding notes. But one of the assignments that they have to do, and their next one is going to be due on this Friday, is an evidence log. Now, we haven't even started an argument yet. And I just told my students, I'm like, look, you have to just trust me. And since the beginning of the year, they've been filling in evidence logs, and I'm going to zoom in. Folks, this is, if you want to get a better look at this before I make an argument video, which I will do at some point, you want to press the print screen button on your computer keyboard right now, which is probably in the top right-hand corner, because that's going to take a screenshot of your computer screen. And it's going to be on, like if you open up a Word document or a Google Doc and hit Control-V, it'll paste a picture of your screen so you can kind of see this. You can kind of have this picture of what goes into these categories. But every 2.5 weeks, my students are required to turn in a log where they just describe 2 of the most impactful moments of their lives, 2 of the most impactful moments of other people's lives, 2 of the most impactful moments they've seen in the media, or they've at least heard about in the media, and then 2 of the most impactful moments that they know from history or politics or just something about their culture. And every week, every like 2.5 weeks, they have to turn in 2 new ones. So they're like, yeah, but I already told you my most impactful moments of my life. And I'm like, good, go dig deeper. Give me 2 more of your most impactful moments. And I'm really forcing kids to reflect and whatnot. And when they write about it, you're going to notice, I don't have the directions here because I don't need to give the directions anymore. But the directions on the first set said you have to do this in a minimum of 3 sentences and a maximum of 5. So my kids, for each one of these columns, at minimum, are going to have 6 sentences about 2 different scenarios in their life, or up to 10 sentences in each one of these. And what's going to happen is when we move into argument, I'm going to have them take out all of this work that they've been doing, thinking about all of these examples, and I'm going to say, okay, here's our first argument prompt. What example do you have from those 5 sheets that you turned in that could potentially tie into this? And they'll already have very specific examples. And we're going to say, how can we get this to work for the prompt and whatnot? But the examples come from varied sources, their own selves, other people that they actually know, history and media and culture and stuff like that. So that's what I've been doing this year to kind of lay the groundwork. And I tell my kids all the time, you don't have a clue why I'm assigning this, but you will, and you're going to thank me for it when we get into argument. I also just used S cubed, as Beth said, when my kids pull their evidence. That just stands for subjects, society, and self. That's where they can pull their evidence from. I tell them that hypotheticals almost always suck, so just don't do them. But kids fall back on them an awful lot. Hey, we got a question in the chat here about synthesis, Beth, which I'm happy to address. I bet we're happy to address. What is your suggestion to your kids about direct citations versus paraphrasing sources on the synthesis paper?
So that's a good question, because right now we're really working on, and this is kind of a skill that I introduced in rhetorical analysis too, selecting short quotes, because especially my 10th graders, they want to take like an entire 3 sentences that some other author has said. And I'm like, no. Like
we did a whole paragraphs. I get it. Struggles here.
We did a whole mini lesson with them a couple weeks ago about like, just choose a short quote, and that way they can embed it more easily. I like to see students try to practice embedding their evidence. And with that, I also try to teach them through different like sentence frames and practice, just not leading in with according to source B. I don't mind if they say like the original source credentials. So like according to a graph from the U.S. Department of Education. I'm fine with that.
Because you need that character of the U.S. Department of Education. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's part of what I try to get them to realize is like, you need to very briefly look at the box above the source and the italicized portion to figure out where the source came from, because calling it source B is incredibly arbitrary. And I do want them to put the parenthetical at the end, because we do MLA, and in not necessarily junior year, but senior year, they get taught APA. If they take college English. So I try to make sure that they understand what a parenthetical citation is. And usually that's not a super difficult skill for them. But I tell them, like, when I'm reading, if I see your parenthetical citation, that helps me as well, as opposed to you saying according to source B. It just doesn't sound as good. So I try to get them to embed short quotes when they can, but there are certain times where it just sounds better to paraphrase. So we kind of practice both techniques, and I leave it up to them, but I like to see at least 1 or 2 quotes per paragraph, because maybe it's just me, but my eyes are drawn to it. And so it just feels better to me when it's there. Whereas I had a student once submit a whole essay, and all the evidence was paraphrased, and the essay was well written, but there was something off about the reading experience. And maybe it's just me being me, but I was like, I really wanted some quotes in here. So that just might be a me thing, but I think it's important for students to know how to embed, because that's not something that's just going to be a synthesis thing. It helps with rhetorical analysis, and it will help them tremendously in college too. So we want to kind of think big picture here as well.
Beth, while I answer this question, just note that someone is seeking clarification of the difference between outside knowledge and experience. And so think about that. When it comes to quotes and paraphrasing, for me, I want to point out that I know a very, very, very excellent AP Lang and AP Lit teacher named Mary Joselle, and hopefully some of you have been able to work with Mary. She's Mary Jo. She's absolutely incredible. She's one of the co-authors on the Ideas in Argument book. And she's amazing, incredible. She encourages her kids to paraphrase above all else on test day. And she teaches her kids to do it very, 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 very well. So please note that that is a successful technique, especially if you teach your kids to do it well. I do not, and the reason why I do this is because I think that when kids can integrate quotes seamlessly, and they can use brackets the right way, and they can use ellipses, and they can change conjugations, and the quote flows. I think that's sophisticated writing that most kids can't do at the high school level, and I think it's a way to show. I think it's a way to be impressive in terms of their writing. The other reason why I make them use quotes as well, besides that I really focus on the expectation of the seamless quote, is because I always tell kids, let's pretend that I had to go get a new job and it had nothing to do with my performance at where I'm working, but they just couldn't keep me for whatever reason. And I was walking down the hallway with this potential new principal, and the principal said, "Well, how does your current administration feel about you?" And I could say, "Well, they've told me that they've liked me and that they've been impressed with how I'm doing." I always ask my kids, would it be better for me to say that, or would it be better for me to be like, you know what? I actually have a letter from my principal who can tell you himself in his own words. And when that happens, I'm like, look at it. Which one is a more accurate picture and is going to have more weight? And it's going to be that letter from the principal. And so I'm like, that's why we want to kind of use the direct quotes as much as we can, because the weightiest parts, if we can get them to be saying it, the authoritative person saying it, it's going to really strengthen your writing significantly better, as opposed to just paraphrasing it. So, because if we paraphrase, we got to take their word for it. But if we directly quote it, we can see it. Hopefully, the kids don't sabotage it. Beth, did you take care of the outside knowledge and experience?
Yes. So I just put it in the chat, but basically, for those that are curious, because people watching the replay or something might not see the chat. Outside knowledge for my students is typically things like sports, pop culture. It's kind of a catch-all category. Experience is either their personal experience or possibly experience of people they know. So if they want to tell me about Taylor Swift's experience with her many boyfriends, that falls under outside knowledge, not experience.
Got it. All right.
And I say that because I have a feeling that if the prompt allows for it this upcoming year, I have a feeling that we're going to be reading a lot about Taylor Swift because she just released an album.
Yeah, I bet you're probably right. That brings us to another question that we have in here, Beth, and I'm cool with staying for about 5 more minutes if you are.
Sure.
It says, how long do you spend in synthesis and in argument? I'm in synthesis now and want to squeeze a bit of argument in before the end of the semester. So how long do you typically spend in argument and synthesis?
So that's a good question. I think, honestly, I spend the most time in rhetorical analysis because I start with that and then we go back to it before the exam. So that's the bulk of the time. I spend, because maybe it's because I start with synthesis, but also it's also the time period. So like November to December for us is super interrupted with Thanksgiving break, Christmas break, every field trip you could possibly imagine. So I technically spend longer on it because I have fewer class days. So if I say I spend like 7 weeks on it, please know that that's not actually like 35 class periods. It's a lot less because we're constantly being interrupted. So I probably spend the most on rhetorical analysis and then synthesis and then argument. But it's because when we get to argument, since they've done synthesis, we can work with a few practice prompts and just kind of go through argument and they get it. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but like, I think you absolutely, if you are teaching a year-long class, and you want to squeeze in a little bit of argument, you absolutely can. I think it's fine. Like, honestly, if you just explain to them, synthesis is an argument with sources, and now we're doing argument, so you have to be your own source of knowledge. I think that would be okay. Because the skills overlap. So it's not like you're starting something totally arbitrary and new.
Right. So for me, what I do is I spend about 10 weeks on rhetorical analysis, and then I shift to about 6 to 8 weeks for argument, depending on the kids that I have. And then I can get synthesis done in 3 weeks. And the reason why is because I just teach synthesis as argument with sources. So I don't really have to do much besides really focus on the embedding of the quotes. Commentary happens the same way. and why are we picking this source as opposed to that source? What are the biases of this source as opposed to that source? But I can do that within 3 weeks. So that's the nature of how quickly I do those kind of things there. Kelly asked about ideas for helping kids tackle archaic text. Beth, were you with me earlier this week when I was doing archaic texts?
Yes, I think so. Well, the satire one.
Yeah,
Yes.
the satire and archaic text. Yeah, okay. But do you have any tips for archaic texts?
Just a couple that come to mind. If students are reading it, I feel like they need to, I don't want to say annotate more frequently, but I think they need to make sure as they're reading that they kind of do like a comprehension check, because sometimes they're like, I don't know what this said, and it's like, well, you do know some, if not most of the words. So just kind of like annotate something. And I know that you give this tip, so I don't want to like totally take credit for it by any
That's
means,
okay.
but the focusing on the verbs, I think that's super helpful.
Yeah.
But because some of the passages, I think it was from some old practice tests that I gave the kids. I swear the whole column was like one paragraph and there were no paragraph breaks. And the kids just kind of looked at it and they're like, how do I read this? And they felt so overwhelmed because not
That's
only
a
was the
Hazlitt piece. I
language
guarantee it. That is a piece by William Hazlitt. No doubt about
and
it.
they like, not only is the language difficult, but they don't have those natural breaks where they can kind of pause. So for that, I told them, like come to a natural stopping point and just like breathe for a second, take a note or two to remember what you were talking about or what you were reading. So I think that helps with like focusing on the verbs. If there aren't paragraph breaks, they need to kind of break it up for themselves. Though I'm really hoping they don't put anything like that on the exam where there's just like a wall of text. It just gives me flashbacks to, I had to take a class in college about Dickinson, or no, not Dickinson, Dickens, Charles Dickens. We had to read Bleak House and every other book he wrote, it seemed like. And I just remember thinking like, man, this guy uses a whole lot of words. And I know that's how my students feel when they read some of these archaic passages, is like, it's overwhelming. So focusing on the verbs helps. I would say also there's a few words that mean different things in like want doesn't mean desire.
That's the most important one. Yep.
And there might have been a couple others, but that one, because it came up in it's a passage from
it's Hazlitt on the want of money, and he meant the lack of money.
One, and then John Downes' letter to his wife, which
it's
in there too. I think it said want. So anyway, like, and it's in I think it's in A Modest Proposal at one point. I can't remember though. But anyway, it's in something that I teach my kids. And so I have to kind of let them know what that means as well. So those are like the first things that come to mind with archaic language. But yeah, all of our kids struggle with it. So you're not alone in that boat.
Yeah. So I am going to share something with you all that I don't really share very often. So but we're gonna put this right in the chat for you.
If it's what I think it is.
Oh, it's what you think it is. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share with you all a link to my satire Padlet. So I actually Connie, have a great one. Have a great one, Connie. Down in Hawaii. I'm thrilled that you even came to join us, by the way. Thank you so much. And I have, maybe I don't. Oh, there it is. Got it. I was gonna say, I'll put the link in here. I'm not gonna go over the whole thing. Oh, what the heck? Sorry, it's not working. There it is. Good. Okay. So I'm gonna put this in here. This is a link to a satire thing that I do. I'll share my screen here a little bit, and I'll just give you a couple quick little tips. But what I do with archaic language actually starts with here. It's called The Triune Tale of Diminutive Swine, and it's basically a story, and it's a contemporary satire, but it's written in archaic language except for one character, and I'll let you all read it and figure it out. This is just the comedian actually performing it. But the kids all know it's the Three Little Pigs while they read it, even though they don't know any of the language in it. They don't know anything at all. They know very little, but they can figure it out because they work with what they know instead of what they don't know. And most of the time when kids go into reading archaic language, they're like, I don't know this, so I just can't read it. The other thing that I do before I even give them this, though, is I bring up an Instagram photo of me with a former student of mine, and I have them read the hashtags, and I have the kids tell me about what my friend and I were doing. And they'll narrate my whole night. they'll narrate my relationship, how I know this kid, what we did that night, how we did all these little things here. Okay. And the kids can narrate my whole night when they're looking at disparate hashtags. If they can look at disparate hashtags and create an entire narrative that's accurate, and then I give them actual language and they're like, I don't even know what it says. I don't know. How is that possible? How is that possible? I don't even have an understanding. And so I try to build their confidence with, like, I'm giving you real language. If you can read hashtags, that's the case. But I also bring up the hashtags, and this comes from Crystal Liberty, who did one of my recent Garden of English videos. Hopefully she'll do a couple more for us, and she'll hopefully become our consultant for honors English. So we're going to try to do a summer session for honors English this year. We're going to try to do at least 1 week of one for teachers that are like, we're not AP teachers, but we want some PD. So anyway, stay tuned for that, or tell your partners to. But Crystal did a video for me about using personal examples in argument, but this comes from her. She actually has kids hashtag archaic text. So as they read, to provide little summaries, they hashtag. Or she had them write summaries that were 140 characters or less, because that's Twitter, and then hashtag it. And I make my kids do it with Modest Proposal, and I mix satire and archaic language together because it's very hard. They're both very hard, so I'm like, why not just deal with the two hardest ones at the same time? But the kids really love doing, like, hashtagging their summaries, and so I would encourage you all to consider doing that. So you've got that link right here to the Padlet. You can see all those kind of cool assignments there, and that's what I would do to address the struggle that is real, that is called archaic language.
Yeah, I posted a link to the YouTube video as well. At least I hope it works, because I showed my students that after you recommended it last year, and they loved the Three Little Pigs comedy sketch. Like, they thought it was hilarious. So, well, one class did. That my classes last year were very opposite. So my morning class was kind of like, meh, it's funny, we get it. My 8th period was like, I need this link to show my parents.
Yes, that's what we want. Go.
So highly recommend that one as well, because they understand what the guy's saying. But like, if you actually listen to the language, like, it is archaic language. So yeah, definitely like that one as well.
All right, Beth, I'm cool with signing off if you're cool with signing off, unless there's a question that we did not hit and we don't want anybody to feel like they were left out.
I don't see one. I think we answered everything in the Q&A, and I was just checking the chat to make sure that we got everything. But definitely let us know for next time. I think we're hopefully going to do something about, like, scoring or like that. So if you guys ever have any requests, if you're like, hey, could you, like, do a mini lesson on this, not just answering questions, we would be happy to. So reach out and let us know what topics, because it's fun for us to answer questions, but we both also don't mind, like, doing a mini lesson as well, or a presentation. It sounds like scoring student samples might be good. Well, we're working on getting some that are not from the College Board for copyright reasons, but also I find it more helpful when it's, like, outside samples as well, because we have access to other things. So we will definitely do scoring hopefully next time.
Yeah. And, we'll look at one type of paper at a time. Oh, Chris, the multiple choice and how to teach it and whatnot, we can totally talk about that too. That'd be a good one, Beth, I think, as well. So if anybody wants resources, like I put the Venmo and stuff in there. And then if you're willing, sign up for our Facebook community so we can work with one another and grow our crafts, because that's what we're trying to do. How can we support one another in the easiest ways that we know how? So anyway, it was a pleasure to see you there, Beth, and it was a pleasure to see you again in person last week.
Yes, absolutely.
We'll be in touch as we prepare for other things.
For those who are joining us, our next one is November 27th, which is going to be after Thanksgiving. But please make sure you're following either Tim or me or both of us, ideally both of us, on social media, because we might have something else to tell you about between now and then. Yeah, that is true. How could I forget? So anyway, we hope to see you all next time as well. But thank you for spending your evening with us, and good luck everybody tomorrow with Halloween. And I know we teach high school students, but sometimes it gets a little crazy. Yeah, no, but most of a lot of us have kids. It's always going to be crazy. So, all right, have a great one. All right, bye. Thanks, everybody. Bye.